Hello everyone! In this video, we will define some terms that will be used in discussing a listening technique called motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing seeks to leverage the nature of how people change to give the listener a guide to help the speaker work through potential changes they may need to make. I'll define what motivational interviewing is in a minute. First, I want to say that I am not an expert. I have had no formal training with this technique in a counselor setting, or in any other setting for that matter. My experience comes mostly from what I've read and the little amount that I've been able to practice this technique in my time in higher education. By the end of these videos, you won't be an expert, but you will have some basic skills that will help you in dealing with people who seem to be stuck in making a change in their life. Furthermore, understanding motivational interviewing may help you work through the changes you want to make in your own life. So I'm not trying to make you a counselor through these videos. I simply want to equip you with some tools to help others as they may try to change or make a change in their life, specifically in regards to academic habits. Originally, motivational interviewing was a listening technique developed by the clinical psychologist William Miller to help alcoholics who wanted to make a change. And developed isn't even quite the right word. Miller actually identified how he and other effective counselors worked with clients and then studied the effects of it. So how does it work? Basically, you listen to the person speak, reflect back what you hear, and do this in a way that guides the person toward deciding to make the change they desire. Helping them to make a change that is their desire is a really important aspect, which I'll talk more about in the video. You listen for where the person is at on the change spectrum. Change spectrum is what we will mainly address in the second video in this series. Then you hold a mirror up to show them both sides of the argument for and against change. This is one of the fundamental objects of what you do in motivational interviewing. You're helping the person weigh the pros and cons. The two sides of the argument is the status quo and the change. The status quo is the current set of behaviors they are acting out right now. Generally, these are behaviors that are having a negative impact on their well-being. Things like not going to class and not doing homework. The other side of the argument is the change. These are new behaviors that will replace the negative behavior. Now let's go ahead and define some terms that we will be using in other videos. Ambivalence. Ambivalence, properly defined, is when you have two opposing feelings about something. For example, you really want to get a good grade on the test tomorrow, but you also really want to hang out with your friends and go see that midnight premiere of insert movie you're interested in. You feel pulled between two options that you desire. This tension between the pros and cons is called ambivalence. Self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is one's belief in one's own ability. In our discussion of motivational interviewing, self-efficacy will mostly refer to one's belief in one's own ability to change. Change talk. This is a really psychology-sounding thing to me, but it's not really complicated. Change talk is essentially language that indicates a person may be open to change. There are four basic types of change talk. Disadvantages of the status quo. From our previous example, a statement like, "I'll be exhausted in the morning," would be acknowledging bad sides of the status quo, in this case, going to the movie. Advantages of change. This is basically the inverse of the first. "I'll have 3 more hours to study, plus a full night's sleep." Optimism for change. This has to do with self-efficacy. In our example, they might say, "Even though I know it's going to be hard to say no, I can say no." Intention to change. A statement like, "I'm going to go home right now and start studying. I'll also text my friends to tell them maybe another time." Our final term is Clifton. Clifton is my imaginary friend that we will use to show how this whole motivational interviewing thing works. With Clifton, we will create a scenario with a hypothetical person. So who is Clifton? Well, Clifton is a freshman who has spent his entire first 5 weeks of college goofing off. He's doing things like staying up late, skipping class regularly, missing homework, and various other activities that seem to only detract from his lifelong dream of going into ego-gastronomy to help create a safer and more sustainable future for this generation and those to come. So now that we've defined these terms, we are ready to address the spirit of motivational interviewing. Another way to think of this is that these ideas are the underpinning for what is valued in motivational interviewing. These two propositions are assumed to be true. The two major assumptions that motivational interviewing makes are that each individual can answer their own problems and each individual is solely responsible for change. Wow, that takes a lot of the weight and responsibility off of you as the listener. To help support why these two assumptions are important, let me use an example of the opposite of these two axioms. The example I want to use is the tough love approach. You may know what I'm talking about. It's when the listener tells the person speaking exactly what they need to do. It's the teacher who has a sit-down talk with the student and says, "Look, if you don't change A, B, and C, you're going to end up wrecked." Does this kind of interaction work? Well, maybe sometimes. But when the tough love approach works, it's not because the person heard something they hadn't thought of already. Change happens because that person decided to make a change. They stood up and took responsibility for their actions. The tough love approach has great potential for evoking what we call resistance within a person. What motivational interviewing seeks to do is allow the individual to articulate what it is in their mind and help guide them toward the decision they want to make. That person has the answers. What they are struggling with is deciding to do the right thing. The first value in motivational interviewing is to acknowledge and respect the autonomy of the individual. Each individual is free to make the decisions they want to make. Speaking with people through the lens of motivational interviewing means that you respect what they value and believe. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to share those values, but you must respect them. In fact, if you don't respect them, you may end up getting into a combative and unhelpful interaction. In valuing autonomy, you also acknowledge those underlying axioms. This person knows what needs to change and is responsible for making the change happen. The next value of motivational interviewing is collaboration. The listener works together with the speaker to figure out what needs to happen. This requires the listener to find out what the speaker values, desires, and wants out of life. Then, once these things have been established, you can brainstorm together how they might achieve those desires. The listener isn't the person with sage wisdom and counsel. They are a co-worker. This value is tied to the next value, which is exploration, not exhortation. You are not the sage on the stage giving out advice. You are there to help them resolve their own ambivalence. This means it is okay to take time to look at all sides of a behavior. It is okay to explore the positive aspects of a negative behavior. An example would be choosing to not study means you have time to do other things. And that's nice. Now, you don't want to focus on these reasons for not changing, but you at least need to acknowledge them as valid. Another major value of motivational interviewing is for the listener to foster an environment that is conducive to change. This is of great importance to always keep in mind, especially as a listener. You will need to respond to things that are said. Your responses can't be grounded in what you want. They must take the speaker's desires into account. The listener lets the speaker lead while helping to focus on positive movement toward change. The person is always free to take or leave your ideas. Finally, the overall goal of motivational interviewing is to increase intrinsic motivation. The idea is to help the person to get to a place where they are internally motivated to change. This goes against that idea of tough love, where you say it like it is, or maybe you pressure them to feel bad about it, but not to think any differently. Extrinsic motivators can be helpful, but ultimately, when whatever pressure those external motivators exert on us is gone, then there's no reason to continue. Intrinsic motivation doesn't require any external force. You can rely on it when no one is looking. The main way intrinsic motivation is achieved is through working through the speaker's ambivalence. The idea is to help them figure out what they think about the change so that they can decide how they want to address the need for change. These 5 values should be at the center of every response the listener makes and every idea generated. Next, we will discuss the 4 principles of motivational interviewing. The principles are the techniques you use to actually walk out these 5 core values. These principles are broad ideas with very specific tactics you can use to accomplish each principle. In this section, I'll give you the main ideas and the practical tools you can use to accomplish those main ideas. These principles aren't a formula, these are guides within the values of motivational interviewing. The 4 principles are express empathy, develop discrepancy, roll with resistance, and support self-efficacy. Express empathy. Empathy is all about acceptance. We tend to think of empathy as putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but that isn't quite accurate. Empathy is accepting what the person tells you it feels like to be in their shoes. Empathy is accepting where the other person is at, how they feel, and what they think about a situation. Empathy isn't about agreeing with the other person, it's about understanding. In motivational interviewing, it is important to actually express this empathy. You should look to express what your understanding is of how the person feels and what they think. Let's use Clifton as an example.
I really love hanging out with my friends. They're what are getting me through each day. I'm not sure what they'd think if I stopped hanging out with them really late at night. What if I miss out?
An empathetic response may sound something like this. Your friends are your main support, and you're worried you may grow apart if you don't hang out with them late at night. That's a really important and reasonable concern, Clifton. This reflection expresses how his friends are a positive influence in some ways and that his concerns are understandable. It's not crazy to feel like he may be missing out on some stuff. Expressing that the concern is reasonable says that his conflicted feelings are normal. That's another way to express empathy. The next principle is developing discrepancies. This isn't poking holes in the person's thought process. That would just be argumentative and counterproductive. The purpose of developing discrepancies is to amplify the difference between current behaviors and the overall beliefs and values of the person. Here's Clifton again. Let's say he has expressed he really values being an A student and getting homework done, yet his disregard for class assignments conflicts with this value. Clifton says,
"There are a lot of fun things to do when I stay up late, even though it makes it hard to go to my 8 a.m. class."
You can see that staying up late makes skipping class easier for Clifton. You've also heard him talk about how attending class is important to him because he doesn't want to miss content. You may want to respond with, "You want to have a good time and you want to attend class. You're struggling to do both." By developing the discrepancy, your aim is to have Clifton tell you why he should change his behavior, not have you tell him why. Developing discrepancy highlights the importance of change. To make a distinction, highlighting the importance is not pointing out how much or what needs to change. Developing discrepancy highlights why it is important to the person to change. You seek to find the intrinsic motivation within that person. The next principle is rolling with resistance. Details of this principle are discussed in a separate video of its own. Resistance is when someone uses language that goes against the needed change or when they argue against the positives. In motivational interviewing, resistance is to be expected. When resistance is encountered, the speaker should do their best to acknowledge the resistance and try to change to a different topic or line of reasoning. There are several different kinds of resistance, but here's the overarching principle. Arguing with the person is counterproductive. When you roll with reference, When you roll with resistance, you assume the other person is an intelligent and capable being, someone who is able to come to their own conclusion. Out of respect, when they become defensive, you acknowledge their concerns. Clifton says,
I really like playing video games online, I just don't want to stop.
You reply, you enjoy video games and you aren't sure you can stop. He becomes defensive and says,
I can stop whenever I want, I'm just not sure I want to.
Affirming his autonomy allows him to not feel threatened. This avoids an argument. When you encounter resistance, this should be a signal to you that you should probably change your approach. Instead of focusing on the amount of video games Clifton plays, you can focus on the things that he says that he values, like the environment. The final principle is supporting self-efficacy. You want to offer the person hope. Hope that they can achieve their goals and hope that they have the ability to change. Supporting self-efficacy is not telling them things that aren't true about themselves. If they start making unrealistic plans that are over their capability, part of supporting self-efficacy is confronting them with the limits of their capabilities while not focusing on their deficiencies. You look to help them gain a realistic perspective on their strengths. This enhances one's confidence. Anything that you say should always have a positive outlook on that person's abilities. Motivational interviewing is a mindset. Though there are specific techniques within motivational interviewing, it is still not for every situation. You need to know when to use it and when it may not be appropriate. This comes with time, but a general rule of thumb is that you can use motivational interviewing when talking with someone who desires to make a change but is uncertain how to make it happen. Motivational interviewing is a powerful tool to help you listen, empathize, and respond. Use it wisely. Thanks for listening. Until next time.